Tēnā koutou whānau, nau mai hoki mai ki tō tātou nei Wānanga Bite tuatoru. Kia ora whānau, welcome back to Wānanga Bite number 3 in this series relative to the proposed changes by the government in the ETS. In the first Wānanga Bite, we covered off why Māori want the exotic category, which is in summary that we want the option for sustainable development. And that's enabled through access to capital and joint venture partnerships on Māori land, which is not something we as Māori normally have available to us. This will provide substantially better economic returns versus dry stock farming, and the environmental benefits are significant versus dry stock farming. And finally, this category creates a safe and economically beneficial way for us to restore our native high forests. In the second wānanga, we discuss why a number of self-interest groups don't want this category. At its core, the issue is these powerful, well-organised and very well-funded organisations with long histories and substantial political influence will have their income substantially cut. In a world where farming needs to become more efficient and emissions need to be reduced, these organisations will have less funding coming out of that sector, and that is of concern for them. Most farmers now understand the significant benefits and opportunities that this permanent category has for them, both financially, economically, and environmentally. But their representative organisations continue to meet their own political needs and agenda. We need more forests on the 51% of land area in Aotearoa that is currently used for farming. We are in a climate emergency. We need to transform the land area. In this Wānanga Bite, we will address the major stated concerns of Minister Nash with this permanent category and why he doesn't support this substantial, beneficial opportunity for both Māori and Pākehā alike. We'll do this alongside some possible political issues that could be driving the decision-making framework applied. It's not the intent to discuss or refute all the Minister's concerns. There are a few more that we could address, but we are simply going to address the more sensationalist ones. The first thing, the timing and the condensed time frame of this consultation. We consulted on this category only last year. So what's changed? Why is it being consulted again? And why the rush? Any feedback would be speculation on my part outside of the stated concerns in the consultation documents or the statements from various senior Labour Party ministers. However, there is an election pending in roughly 16 odd months. The Labour Party ministers in charge of this rushed change in policy are non-Māori. They have farmers as their constituency, either through portfolio or through their actual electorates. And they seem to be aligning a lot of policy change to service the well-funded self-interest lobby groups. A coincidence, perhaps? This rushing of policy change in and of itself says much and is something that needs addressing because the effect of this change is substantial, particularly for Māori. Utilising the government's own figures, the NPV, or net present value, of permanent exotic forestry is $30,000 per hectare. Sheep and beef farming is anywhere between $4,500 and $20,000 per hectare. Rather than providing a crash course in understanding net present value, I'll summarise by saying that means value lost to landholders by not having this category available is anywhere between 33% and 650% loss or downside. Given Māori land is predominantly at the lower end of the productivity scale, being on land use classification 6 to 8. As I've said before, 80% of our land is in that category. It's safe to assume that the value destruction for Māori without this category is closer to 650% versus dry stock farming. So why aren't Māori being given the opportunity and time to understand this? A lot of Māori landholders are unlikely to even know the changes in the pipeline, let alone the implications. Where is the balanced promotional activity? Where is the education processes for Māori landowners? How can the government even engage effectively with Māori in 5 or 6 weeks when they don't have a representative partner to work with on this topic? Ngā Paua Tāne, the recently formed National Māori Forestry Association, is working towards this end, but given its infancy and lack of resourcing and capacity at the moment, is proving very, very difficult. Despite this, we have a small, committed group, including the board, who continue to work in our own time to ensure Māori landowners have a representative voice. So the timing and the rush of this consultation is a real concern, and we can only speculate as to why in terms of the political implications, but the outcomes remain negative for Māori. Minister Nash also uses some interesting justification for that change, which I'll cover next and offer an alternate view. Minister Nash uses sensational terms like ecological disaster and treason slash on our beaches and in our rivers to sell the concept that all the pine trees will fall over in 100 years. So let's examine this a little further. It is true that the life expectancy for radiata pine is around 90 years old. It is also true that the life expectancy for a Māori woman in New Zealand is 77.1 years, compared to a non-Māori woman at 84.4, interestingly enough. This does not mean that all the Māori women in New Zealand will die at 77. So to infer that all the radiata will simply up and die at 90 years of age is simply mischievous by the minister to infer it. Another element of this sensationalist set of statements is the inference that at 100, when all these trees fall over, all at the same time, that we will end up with all these trees in the rivers and on the beaches, similar to what happened at Uawa 4 years ago. In rebuttal, first, they won't all fall over of old age at the same time. Second, a storm event that can mobilise logging residue into a waterway, as what happened in Uawa 4 years ago, is very different to the type and magnitude of the storm event that will be needed to move entire forests and trees into waterways. Is it possible? Sure. Is it likely? Not really. Getting struck by lightning 10 times is also possible as well, but it's not likely. Finally, the Minister has asked for the reference material that reinforces his position, which is not coming. That is, we've asked for that information and it's not been made available. Not to say it doesn't exist, simply that there is no research that has been made available to examine the Minister's claim that all the pine trees are going to fall over at 90 to 100 years old. In this, I also note that the wording the Minister uses, but is not emphasised, is the word possible. So he talks about a possible ecological disaster caused by pine trees in 100 years. In summary, and to this point, around the so-called possible ecological disaster, it's based on some tenuous at best assumptions, if I'm being generous, that are not research founded or data-based, and these tenuous inferences are used to support the Minister's sensationalist statement of possible ecological disaster in 100 years. To this, I respond and say, very unlikely, Minister. And to quote your leader and our Prime Minister, we are in a climate emergency right now, not possibly. We need to reduce emissions and sequester carbon. Pine trees are a great way to do this. And with the permanent category, that allows us to monetise the activity on marginal Māori land and transition to native if we wish to. And I suggest most Māori landowners with remote Māori land will be very interested in this category to do exactly that, transition. 75% of our clients at Whenua Oho are interested in doing exactly that as well, which is one of the reasons we are personally aligned to the idea that we keep this category. And that brings me to the second major issue we have with Minister Nash's statements, that there is no research that supports the transition of pine into native. There is no polite way to say that this is rubbish. I could cite many research papers that support the transition of pine to native, and accept that pine has only been in Aotearoa for 160 years, so there's definitely more work to be done. However, published on the MPI and Te Rūrākau website is a summary of research done on the topic with 5 pages of references, and in that it states that pine to native transitional forests can be done. It says so on the MPI website. It would be more likely if the transition is managed. That is also very clear. And that more research is wanted or required, which is also very clear. But it clearly says that it is possible, that it is likely, and that if it's managed, it's very likely to be able to be done. Also published on the MPI website is a generic plan on how to do it. This is on the Minister Nash's website for his ministry, Te Rūrākau. So not only does the research support the idea that pine to native transitions can be done, and not only is a how-to guide published on the Te Rūrākau website, but we know of a number of actual physical sites around the country that are doing just that, transitioning to native from pine. And in some of these cases, that's despite any intervention from humans. And we have invited the Minister with his master's degree in forestry to come and have a look at any number of these. Hopefully he takes us up on that. At this point, I note that the Minister cites there is no research supporting pine to native transition. Without research support, native should be allowed in the permanent category, which is interesting. He's saying that there's no research for pine to native transitioning, but then without any research, then says we should have natives in the permanent category. Whilst no one has an issue with this, particularly Māori, the reality is that with the current policy settings in the ETS and without substantial incentivisation, natives planted only on bare land is fraught with danger and the likelihood of failure if not intensively managed. On top of which, and to be a little facetious, we haven't seen any evidence that supports the assertion that native planting will help us sequester all the carbon we are targeting with our various emissions targets. As a Māori, we don't necessarily need evidence or research to support this. We know this is the right thing to do. We just don't have the access to millions in funding to make it happen. In closing, perhaps we should ask Ministers Shaw and Ministers Nash not to spend the billions of dollars they are planning to spend offshore planting forests so we can keep emitting here and farming and energy combining to be 90% of our total gross emissions. And that perhaps we should spend that billions of dollars in Aotearoa, recloaking our own whenua, enhancing our own waterways, controlling our own erosion, restoring our own biodiversity, and doing our part to help save our planet without paying someone else to do it for us. Once again, being a little facetious, we won't perhaps ask for this money to be kept here to restore Papatūānuku. We'll demand it. Tēnei te mihi kia koutou. Kia ora rā.